Hello Year 2 and welcome to your fifth lesson for history this half term about looking at how did the Great Fire change London. So we're going to start, as we always have done so far, with our knowing more, remembering more, and we're looking at today, could the fire have been stopped? That's our learning question that we're going to look at. So question 1 says, people escaped the Great Fire with what possessions they could by boat or cart. Was that true or false? Write your answers down on a piece of paper in front of you. Question 2, how do we know about people who committed crime sprees during the fire? Is it because of paintings, diary entries, court trial records, or videos? And your challenge question, what crime did people commit during the Great Fire? If we go back to looking at our answers, well done those of you who wrote down true. People did escape the Great Fire with what possessions that they could carry by boat or by cart. We know that people actually committed crimes during the fire itself from court trial records that were written at the time. And we know from last week's learning that one of the main crimes that people committed during the Great Fire was actually theft. So today we're going to look at how we can understand the factors behind the spread of the fire. Why did it spread as much as it did during that time period? To know some of the firefighting strategies that were used by the Stuarts at the time, and to identify reasons for and results of the actions that people did and that took place during the Great Fire itself. So if we look at our knowledge organiser, you can see that the two arrows are pointing about how do we know about what happened during the Great Fire. So we're going to be looking at some primary sources today. And we're also going to find out a little bit more about Thomas Bloodworth. So our vocabulary that we already know, we've already come across, are primary sources and king. We looked at those a little bit last week. And some of the words that we're going to be meeting this week, if we do my turn, your turn, fire breaks, strategy, gunpowder, and firefighting. So here we have a primary source because this is a melted piece of pottery, okay? So if this is a melted piece of pottery, what does this actually tell us about the fire? This is actually an artefact that is on display currently at the Museum of London, which was found by archaeologists in Pudding Lane, where the fire started. And it shows that the temperatures reached 1,700 degrees Celsius, which is very, very hot. And it obviously melted what original bit of pottery it was. I don't know if you can try and work out what it was, but Mrs. Lee has not got a clue. So this is what we're going to explore today. What made controlling the fire so difficult? So in 1666, the Great Fire of London scorched 400 of the city's streets. We know that there were around 13,200 houses and 87 churches, all blazing in flames, leaving London in ashes. In the 17th century, people were not as aware of the dangers of fire as we are today. And here we're going to explore some of the reasons why the Great Fire of London was seen and was one of the biggest fires that the world itself has ever seen. So, what made controlling the fire so difficult? Flammable materials. Now we know that this was a time of no electricity. Light itself came from candles, and central heating came from fires. They didn't have radiators, they didn't have torches, they didn't have lights that we have in our living rooms. And also flammable materials like hay, pitch, tar and wood were everywhere. So if something is flammable, it means it can be easily set alight and it burns really quickly. And also, as we know from our other learning last half term, there was a great deal of gunpowder. A tinderbox city. So most of the buildings at the time were made of timber, and the streets were very, very narrow, which sparked a domino effect as the fire started to spread. All the materials that the buildings were made from became the fuel for the fire, which really got out of control quite quickly. And as we already said, temperatures reached up to 1,700 degrees Celsius. So another factor that made controlling the fire difficult was the weather. So we know from our learning previously that the weather itself had been very hot and dry just before the fire itself. And also there were strong winds that made the fire powerful because it would blow the fire and the flames onto the next building. And because of that, it made the fire spread. And only when it started to die down, the wind, did it finally become possible to start controlling the fire itself. There was no water supply. That was another reason why controlling the fire was made so difficult at the time. As the fire reached London Bridge, the water supply was cut off, making it even more difficult to fight the fire to try and stop it. This is actually another primary source, an artefact called a fire squirt. A fire squirt was used to put out fires in the 17th century. That is also an artefact that can be found in the Museum of London. So, what made controlling the fire so difficult? There was a lack of urgency. So we know if something's urgent, it means it's really important. Now, for years, there had been warnings of London's end by fire, which was ignored by the mayor. So people have said for a long time that if there was a big fire in the city, it would destroy the majority of it. But the mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, did not acknowledge that. And not even an announcement of the whole city in flames could actually convince him to do anything about it. Now we know that one of the tactics that the king suggested was in order to fight the fire, was to pull the buildings down to stop it and prevent it from spreading. But when he was asked to order that houses be pulled down, he refused, which means he said no. He underestimated the fire. He said it wouldn't be big, they'd put it out, it would stop soon. And that meant that London itself burnt the ground, the majority of it. So what else made controlling the fire difficult? So there was very limited and unreliable equipment. Okay, firefighting in London was ahead of its time, as we were one of the very few capital cities that had fire engines, but they were not practical pieces of equipment because some of them didn't even have any wheels, so they couldn't go to where the fire was. In the Great Fire, several of these fire engines were so difficult to move that they ended up falling into the River Thames. And when the fire spread even further, the rest of them were not able to get close at all. And there's a picture of one of those examples, but you can see that one has got wheels, but the majority of them did not. So I want you to think about this question. Do you think it would have been possible to stop the fire sooner? If we look at all the evidence we've talked about so far, what does the evidence actually suggest? Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go on to a quiz which you can access as well, called the Great Fire of London. Now, this is a quiz. We're going to encounter two individuals that experienced the Great Fire of London and what it was like, and you're going to be looking at some of the artifacts and some things that they find during their time during the fire itself, and thinking about how significant, how important, and what clues these artifacts give you that will tell you about it. So I'm going to start playing with playing you the introduction.
This is London, and the year is 1666. Do you know what is about to happen? After a long, dry summer, a great fire is going to break out that will change London for fire. Along the way, you'll have to help them as the fire spreads across London. Let's get started. Click the next arrow to continue. Sunday, the 2nd of September, 1666. This is Tom Porter. He's 8 years old and lives on Pudding Lane with his father, who is a builder. Sadly, his mother and brothers died of the plague, like so many other people did last year.
Church bells are ringing at night. Something must be wrong. I smell burning. It must be a fire. I need to find Father so we can get buckets to help our neighbours.
Click the next arrow to continue. This is Jane Birch. She works as a maid in the house of Samuel Pepys on Seething Lane. Here she is with Samuel Pepys and his wife Elizabeth. He keeps a diary that he writes in every day. The diary tells us about the Great Fire. But what other sources do we have to tell us about that time? How do you think we know about the houses people lived in 1666? Click the next arrow to continue. How do we know about the houses people lived in 1666? Which of these items help us know?
So
Click on an item and drag it to the tick if you think it helps us know. Click on an item and drag it to the cross if you think it does not help us know.
So what you're going to need to do is then look at the different objects and the artefacts and drag them, as the lady's already given you the instructions, to whether you think they would tell us about how the houses that people lived in 1666. So I'm going to show you how you can do that. So you'll use your mouse, click over it and drag it. So this is the diary of all the events of Samuel Pepys himself.
That's right. This does help us know about the houses people lived in 1666.
Now, a leather bucket certainly really doesn't give us any information at all, so I would then put that
Excellent.
on the cross.
This does not help us know about houses in 1666.
Now, a picture of some of the houses that existed at the time would tell us
Yes,
certainly about
this
it.
helps us know about the kinds of houses people lived in.
And the half tax document is documents about houses and where people live.
Well done. This helps us to know where people lived in 1666. Well done. Now let's see what's happening to Tom.
Okay, so once you've actually completed that quiz, there is also one I would like you to play on Purple Mash. And it gives you a range of 5 different questions that link to our learning from today. So if I then stop sharing this screen and I go back to the PowerPoint that I shared with you a minute ago. So you have 2 tasks that you need to complete. So to finish off today, we're just going to see if we can test our knowledge of all of the information we've covered in today's learning. So what came from candles and what came from fires? The weather had been very what before the fires started itself. And all the buildings made from something beginning with T on overcrowded streets. So we're going to look ahead to some of the objectives that are going to be coming next. You are going to understand that the fire caused chaos at the time, that some people were not interested in putting the fire out, and the primary sources are integral. They're so important to help historians find out about the past. And today's learning is going to link really well to our next lesson, which will look at how the chaos of the fire made it difficult for the fire itself to be controlled. So I'll see you next week. Enjoy the quiz, everybody. Bye-bye.